Education Centre. My name is Hannah, and I was invited today by the Greater Victoria Public Libraries to teach you all about composting, Red Wriggler worms, and how to build your own worm bin for composting at home. So I'm really grateful to have this opportunity. And before we dive into learning tons of interesting knowledge, I do want to acknowledge that the land that I'm sitting on right now is the land of the Lekwungen peoples. So this land has been stewarded and taken care of and loved by them for thousands and thousands of years, long before me or my family ever came here. So I'm really grateful to those Indigenous peoples who've cared for these lands to allow us to do the work we do today to continue taking care of these environments. Without further ado, let's get started. So to start off, before we jump into talking about worms, I'd like to tell you a little bit more about what is compost. I told you that I work here at the Compost Education Centre, but I'd love to tell you a bit more about what exactly compost is and why it's so important for the environment. So, if we take a look at the compost cycle poster here, this is a great little explanation of how compost is made. So in the first picture, of course, we see all sorts of different natural wastes. And that includes things that we might have from our own homes and especially from our kitchens, such as all sorts of different kinds of food scraps. So for some examples, it could be banana peels, apple cores, eggshells, leftover food that you didn't eat off your plate. All sorts of food scraps like that are one of the key ingredients that goes into compost. Additionally, we can also use things that might be natural wastes from our yard. So for example, that could be dead leaves, dried up grass or straw, as well as paper, because of course paper does come from trees and it's a natural waste product. So if we have old newspaper or brown paper bags, those are also ingredients that we can put into our compost. So we collect up all of those beautiful natural wastes and we might collect them into something that looks like this. Many of you at home might have a little bin, maybe it's brown or maybe it's green or maybe it's made of metal. But this is something that we can use to collect up food scraps in our kitchens and in our homes. So after we've collected up all of those beautiful natural wastes, we can put them into some sort of compost bin. Now many of you might have a green bin like this. That's the one that the city collects, and they make a giant amount of compost in the big city facilities. You might also have a little black compost bin like this, and that's one that you can have in your backyard to use to break down these materials into compost. And the final example here, which looks just like the one I have in front of me, this is a worm composting bin. So we can keep Red Wriggler worms inside of these bins, and they can help to speed up the composting process, and they can also allow us to compost in small spaces or in indoor environments, which is really great because not all of us might have a big backyard where we could set up a compost bin of our own. So once all those materials go into a composter like this, they break down over time with the help of all sorts of living creatures. So that could be tiny, tiny creatures that we can't even see, such as bacteria and microbes and mycelium, which is what mushrooms grow out of. And it can also be bigger creatures that we can see, such as worms, of course, as well as little bugs that people call wood bugs or potato bugs. And also, tiny little white creatures are often seen. They're about this big, and they're a little creature called springtails. So all of those different creatures are living inside of our composters, and they're helping to break down all of those wastes into compost. So finally, once that process is complete inside the bins, it can take usually about a couple of months, and then we have beautiful compost, which looks just like soil. I actually have some here. So once all those wastes are broken down, they look just like a beautiful rich soil. And here's an example of that here. Wow. So it's rich and crumbly and moist and full of good nutrients, everything that was in those food scraps. So we can add this finished compost into our garden beds, just like the ones we have over here. Once we add that compost into our garden beds, we can use it to grow food. All these great nutrients are food for our plants, such as carrots or beets or lettuce or whatever you might want to grow in your garden. So those plants take up the nutrients that were in the compost, and now they're in the food that we can eat as humans. So of course, if we were to harvest some food out of our gardens and eat it, such as these carrots, there might be a little bit of waste left over, like the carrot tops. And any waste that we have can go back into the cycle. So what's really important about making compost is that it's a really sustainable process. Because as you can see, it's a circle. It goes around and around, and at the end of the day, there's really no waste left over, because it can all go back into the cycle and be used to grow new food. So that's a little bit about what compost is. Now, something that many people don't know is that there's actually two key families of ingredients that we need in order to make compost. Believe it or not, we can't just use food scraps. If we were to only use food scraps, our compost would end up really soggy and slushy and wet and smelly, and it wouldn't really look anything like this beautiful finished compost, which looks just like soil that I just showed you. So, I'm going to introduce you to the first family of ingredients that we need in order to make compost. And in order to do that, I have a friend living inside this bin, and their name is Corey. So I'm going to pull out Corey now. Corey, time to wake up. Hi there, my name is Corey the Apple Core, and I live inside of the compost bin with my good friends, Brownie and Dr. Wriggles. And inside of the compost bin, I am a part of the Greens family. Yes, the Greens family. And the Greens family, we are fresh and wet and squishy. Alright, so this is my friend Corey, and as you heard them say, they're a part of a family called the Greens family. Now, this is what many of us think of as the food scraps that we put in. So I have some examples of them here. All sorts of fresh things. So it could be any fruits or veggies that you have left over. Now, these ones, of course, these are fake. And also, I hope that you wouldn't put a whole apple like this into your compost. You want to try to eat as much of it as you can first, rather than wasting. But it could be any sorts of things like this, right? We see pears, carrots, oranges, any sorts of fruits and veggies. And other fresh things could also be things like tea bags or coffee grounds, or even fresh grass clippings, for example. Anything that's bright and fresh and often still juicy a little bit. So those are the things that make up our Greens family. Now, in addition to those, as I was saying, there are other ingredients that we need to add in order to make compost. So I'm going to bring out my friend Brownie now. Hi there, my name is Brownie. I am an oak leaf, and I fell down from the Gary oak tree to join my good friends Corey and Dr. Wriggles inside of the compost bin. And inside of the compost bin, I'm a part of the Browns family. The Browns family, yes, oh wonderful. The Browns family, we are dry and crispy and crackly. So crackly. So, my friend Brownie here, of course, they said that they're an oak leaf and are a member of the Browns family. So the Browns family is the other group of key ingredients that we need in order to make compost. So those browns, I have some examples of them here. They can be all sorts of natural wastes that are dead and dry. So for example, we have fallen leaves, we have wood chips or small twigs, and also things like newspaper. As I was saying, of course, paper we might not think of as natural, but it is made of tree pulp. So it is a natural waste that we can also put into our compost. Other examples could be straw or dried up grass that you might have at home. So those are the two families of ingredients that we need in order to make compost. And those are also the two families of ingredients that we need to add into our worm bin. So next up, I'm going to teach you how we can use these different natural wastes from the Browns family and the Greens family and combine them into a worm composting bin to make our own compost at home, especially in indoor spaces. All right, so to start off talking about worm composting, I would like to teach you a little bit about these very special creatures called Red Wriggler Worms. And they're the friends that we use inside of our worm composting bins. So I have a really handy dandy poster here that shows us some of the different parts of the body of a red wriggler worm. And I'm going to teach you some of those so that we can learn to appreciate how complex these little creatures are, and so that we can also understand their needs. That way, when we're setting up a home for them to live in inside of our composting bin, we can know how to take good care of them by understanding what they need from us. So the first thing I'd like to show you here is the fancy scientific name of a red wriggler worm. And that's an Eisenia fetida. Eisenia fetida. So if you really want to impress someone, you can talk about red wriggler worms using that fancy scientific name, and that's in the language called Latin. So that's the Latin name, and as I've already mentioned, their common name is a red wriggler. Now, I'm sure many of you watching have seen worms before, maybe in places like your gardens, or on your school grounds, or maybe even on the pavement. Especially after it rains, worms sometimes come up out of the soil. Now, those worms that you've probably seen around town are actually not red wriggler worms. They're a different variety called an earthworm, which many of you may already know. So the ones that we usually see outside, those earthworms, are actually very different from red wrigglers. Earthworms are native to this place, and they like to live in big open environments. So they like to have a whole field or a whole garden bed to explore. Whereas red wrigglers, on the other hand, they're actually native to the continent of Asia. So they're from a really long way away, and people brought them here to use for indoor composting. They actually probably wouldn't survive in our outdoor environments here. It gets too cold for them over the winters, and they would probably die off. So we only use them in indoor composting bins. We don't want to be putting them outside into our gardens. And red wrigglers are also unique because they're happy living in small enclosed spaces. So that's really different from an earthworm who needs to live outside in an open area. And of course, you can see that that's what makes these worms so great for composting, is the fact that they can live in small spaces with tons of other worms. I've actually heard that red wriggler worms like to move around in packs of about 50 worms, so in a ball just like this. So they're really happy being all up close together and living like that. Cool. So I'd now love to point out some of the different parts of the red wriggler worm I have here. And this is my friend Dr. Wriggles, who I can show you as an example. So the first part, right at the top of the worm here, this is called the prostomium. And the prostomium is essentially the mouth of a red wriggler worm. You can see it right here on Dr. Wriggles. And the prostomium, however, is actually much larger proportionately to the mouth on a human, for example. So red wriggler worms don't have any eyes or a nose on their face. They just have their prostomium. So imagine if your entire face was taken up by one giant mouth. That's like what the prostomium is for the red wriggler. And so in order to eat, the red wriggler worm extends the top lip of its prostomium out into the soil, and it scoops food into its body. So it's opening that giant mouth and pulling food into its body to eat. And after that food has entered its body, it goes into another organ called the gizzard. Gizzard, that's a fun word to say. So the gizzard is what the worm uses to grind up its food because it doesn't have teeth like you and I. So inside of the gizzard, the worm actually stores little bits of grit. So that could be things like rocks or sand, or inside of a home composting bin, it could be eggshells if we're not adding rocks directly into there. So any of that sort of gritty material, the red wriggler stores inside of its gizzard, and it uses that to grind up its food into a pulp. So it's just like having a miniature blender inside your throat. It's like, and it's blending it all up before it continues digesting it. So after it's been blended, it can keep moving through the long digestive system of the worm. And then of course, once it reaches the end of the worm and it's all been digested and the worm has used some of the nutrients from it, it comes out of the anus of the worm. So that's right at the tip of its tail. And what we call worm poo is worm castings. So castings are that beautiful, rich compost that we can put into our gardens. And that's what I showed you earlier. That compost was actually made by worms. So it's what we call worm castings. It's like beautiful, rich worm poo. Delicious. All right, another cool part of the worm is what's called the Cletellum. So the Clatelum is this thick band here that I'm sure many people have noticed if you've ever looked at a worm before. It has a band around it that kind of bumps up off of its skin, and it's also usually lighter in color. Earthworms have one as well, so even if you've just seen an earthworm, you might have noticed that on it. So the Cletellum is interesting for a number of reasons. First of all, it's the worm's reproductive organ, so only adult worms have one. They usually grow one when they're about 8 weeks old. So if you ever see a red wriggler worm and it doesn't seem to have a Cletellum, then that might be a sign that it's still a baby worm or a juvenile. Maybe it's like a teenager. And so it hasn't grown a Cletellum yet. And in order to mate and make baby worms, the adult worms rub their Cletellums together, and by doing that they exchange fluids that allows them to produce an egg. So worms actually lay little tiny eggs about that big, and they're usually yellow or kind of light brown in color, and you might sometimes see those inside of a worm composting bin. So those eggs are laid into the soil, and then 3 or 4 baby worms hatch out of that egg. Now, another interesting thing about the Cletellum is that it can also indicate to us which end of the worm is where the Prostomium is. So if we see the Cletellum, then we know that that's where the Prostomium is, and that the other end must be the tail. Finally, I would also like to point out this word here is the setae. And this is a part of the worm that you probably can't see just with your eyes. Those are microscopic hairs that cover the entire body of red wriggler worms. They're all over it. And now they don't really feel fuzzy to us because these hairs are so small, but the setae are what the worm uses to grip into the soil and move itself along so that it can burrow down into the soil and doesn't just slip and slide on the surface of it. Now, finally, a few of the other needs that a red wriggler worm has that we need to make sure exist in its environment is that it needs to always be moist. And that's because the worm actually breathes through its skin. And in order for that process to work, the skin has to always be moist. So we want to make sure that the environment it's living in inside our worm bin is kind of the dampness of a wrung out sponge or a dishcloth. Like if you took one and wrung out the water, but it was still a little bit moist. That's what we need our worm bin to be like so that the worm can breathe. Also, worms are what we call photosensitive. And photosensitive doesn't just mean that they don't like having their photo taken or something like that. Photo is actually the Latin word. Remember, that's the fancy science language. So Latin for light. So photo means light in general. And that means that worms are a little bit scared of the light. So they have a natural instinct to burrow down deep into the soil where it's dark. So we also want to make sure that the home we make for our worms is nice and dark so that they don't get overstimulated and they can actually become paralyzed. So that means their body stops being able to move if they're exposed to light for too long. And I've heard that that can actually happen in just 1 hour if worms are out in the light. So we need to make sure that their home is dark and moist so that we can take good care of these worms. Next up, I'm going to show you how you can build that home for them. Alrighty, so here I have an example of one of the worm composting bins that we keep here at the Compost Education Centre. And this bin has a number of features that make it a good home for a worm. So first of all, you'll notice that it's not a clear bin. It's not see-through in a way that would let light in. So it's a nice, thick, dark plastic so that light can't come into the home of the worms, and that way we take care of them because they're photosensitive. Also, you'll notice that there's this little white vent here. There's one on this side as well. And those are air vents because as we talked about, worms do need to breathe and they actually take in oxygen through their skin. So we're making sure that there's air getting into the soil where they're living so that they can breathe through their skin. Finally, maybe you can see on the bottom here, there's a little bit of moisture pooling on the table. And that's because there are drainage holes in the bottom of the bin. So when we make a home for red wriggler worms, we need to make sure that there are holes drilled in the bottom so that if it gets too moist in there, we want it to be moist, but not too moist. If it's too moist, the extra liquid can drip out of the bin and they don't drown in the soil. There could actually be not enough air for them if it ended up being too moist in there. And since we're adding in lots and lots of wet food scraps from the greens family, it can get pretty moist. So that's a really important feature as well. So if you want to set up a bin like this, you could just take any plastic bin that you have that's about this size. You don't want one any smaller than the small kind of half size of a Rubbermaid bin. That would be about the smallest bin you could use for the home for your red wrigglers. And then you could just make those simple adjustments to the bin to make it a good home for them. All right, so I'm going to open up this bin and show you who's living inside. So inside of the worm bin, you can see it's starting to look just like beautiful finished compost, right? It looks like nice soil that we might find outdoors, but there are still some things in it that are not broken down, and that's because we've been feeding our worms all sorts of food scraps. So those are some carrot peels, there's some lettuce, some eggshells, which remember are really important so that they have some grit for their gizzards. So how we would start off to set up a worm bin like this is this one is now starting to look like finished compost. But when it was first set up, it actually had a bed made of brown family materials. So as a reminder, that's things like leaves, shredded newspaper, maybe really small wood chips or straw. Those are the things that we need to put into our bin first to make some bedding for our worms. And over time, they're gonna break that down as well so that it ends up looking like this. So when you first start off your bin, newspaper is a great thing to use, but you do wanna mix it with something else such as leaves. And you would make sure to rip that newspaper into small shreds. So on every piece of newspaper, you'll notice it has a sort of bumpy edge. You'd rip from there and make long, thin strips out of your newspaper. Oh, I'm not doing a very good job. You want to make it into nice thin strips like that. And you would fill up your whole bin with a mixture of newspaper shreds as well as some other natural material. It's best to use a mix of newspaper and something else, like leaves or straw or whatever you have on hand. So after we create that bedding out of the browns material, we could add in some worm friends that we get. And remember, we can't go outside and collect up earthworms because they don't live inside bins like this. We need to get Red Wrigglers. So you can find those from special places where people breed Red Wriggler worms for composting. So you want to make sure you're putting in Red Wriggler worms only. You'll add those friends in, and then once a week, you'll feed your Red Wriggler worms to keep them healthy. And we're gonna feed them using the greens family. So remember, we already have our browns family in there as the bedding, and then we're feeding them once a week using the greens family. So we would take our leftover food scraps and we would dig a little hole into the bin in order to feed it. So I usually recommend feeding them by digging into one corner. So I'd make a hole in the corner like this, add in my food scraps, and usually we want to give them one container about this size. Approximately. It could be a little bit smaller, but about that much food scraps each week. So we would add in the food scraps into there, and then we want to make sure to cover them back up with the bedding that's inside of the bin. And that way other creatures like flies or fruit flies, they won't be attracted to come into the worm bin to eat that food, and we'll also just stop it from smelling. And remember, because the worms like to live down under the soil, it'll mean that the food is in a nice dark place where they can go find it. So that's how we would go about caring for our bin. And we would do that week after week. And over time, usually within a couple of months or so of feeding it every week, once in a while we might need to add new bedding if we notice it's getting too wet. You could add in some more shredded newspaper, more leaves, or more straw, for example. And over time it will begin to break down. So like you can see in this one, this bin is almost ready to harvest. And harvest is the word that we use when it's time to restart our worm bin by taking out all the Red Wrigglers that are already living in there and creating a new home for them. So I'm going to quickly demonstrate what that might look like when it comes time to harvest a worm bin, since this one is just about at that stage. I'll just do a really quick demonstration of what that would look like, and this will also give you a chance to see some of the worm friends that are living in there. So to harvest my bin when it came time, and it's all looking broken down, I would take out a big handful of the worm castings that are in there, and I usually like to use a method where you make little rows. So I would lay out a few rows at a time using the worm castings, just like you see me doing here. And the reason why I'm making thin rows like this is because it will make it easier for me to harvest the worms. Since they're photosensitive, they're gonna climb down to the bottom of these little piles of dirt to get away from the sunlight. And that way they'll be a bit easier to find since they're all at the bottom of the pile. And I can also keep track of where I've already harvested. So if I was picking the worms from here, I could keep moving along the pile. So I remember where I've already harvested the worms. So I'm gonna make some rows like this. And then I like to use some sort of little container to collect the worms into. Now this can be a really big job. I actually just harvested my worm bin at home over the weekend, and it took me and my friend 4 hours to harvest our whole worm bin. There were so many worms living in there that it took a really long time. So it can be hard work when it comes around to time to harvest your worms, since you want to try to find as many of the red wrigglers as you can and take them out of the finished compost. So that those worms can go back into a new home and you can use the compost in your garden. So it is a big chore, but usually it only happens about every 6 months or so, once everything is broken down inside your bin and is looking like what you see here. So to give an example, any food scraps that are not broken down yet, I usually put back into the new bin. And then I'm going to collect up any worms that I see. Here are some examples of them. So I'll also give you a chance to see the worms. So I'm going through the soil. Oh, there's one. And I'm picking out all the worms that I see. When I do this, I also like to look for worm eggs. Remember, I said that they're brown or yellow and little tiny round balls. So I also like to try to take out those worm eggs because they have baby worms inside that I want to be able to put into the new home I'm going to make for the worms. And I'll show you if I find any of those worm eggs here. So there's another worm, and as I collect these up, I'm going to put my worm friends into a container off to the side. So I'm going through here and I'm looking for any worms that I can find. Often they like to kind of shrink back up into the pile because they're afraid of the light, of course. So they're going and trying to hide from the light. That way when you get to the end of the row, there's sometimes a lot of worms hiding there all in one place. So I'm going to keep going through like this and collecting out any worms that I see. And that's the process that you would use to go through the entire bin. So I would go one row at a time, and then any of the finished compost that's all broken down, I would put in a bucket or something off to the side to use in my garden, and then I would restart the home. So I would do the same thing all over again by creating some bedding using the Browns family, and then feeding them every week using the Greens family. And in 6 months' time, we'll have a new batch of compost. So that's the process that you use to take care of red wriggler worms at home and to make your own compost, even in an indoor space. This is a great method to use if you want to make compost and just start off by making a small amount. At my home, I actually keep my worm bin in my bedroom since I don't have much space, but it fits just under a bed. So it's a great way to make compost even in a small indoor space. So we've chatted about how to care for our worms and how we can set up a nice home for them to help us make compost. And I do want to finish off by talking a little bit more about what exactly it is that we can feed our worms. So I mentioned that it's things that belong to the Greens family. However, not every type of food scrap is good to feed to our worms. And this is really important to know if we're going to try to take care of worms at home. So I have some quick examples here of things that are good to feed our worms and some that we want to make sure that we're not feeding to them. So in terms of some examples of things that are good, we have celery stalks, so any kind of raw veggies. We have eggshells, so remember those are really important for them. Apple cores, they love any kind of fresh fruit scraps that are left over for the most part. Banana peels, carrot tops. So those are some examples of good food scraps to feed to our worms. Now, an interesting one that many people might not know is that orange peels are actually something that worms will not eat. Worms don't like any kind of citrus. It's too acidic for them. It can actually burn their skin, and it's also antibacterial. So bacteria don't actually like to grow on it and help break it down. So citrus is something we want to keep out of our worm bin. The one other kind of fresh fruit or vegetable that we want to make sure not to feed them is onions or garlic. Those are also really acidic, and your worms will just never eat them. They'll sit in the bin for a long time, and you'll notice that they never break down. So some of the only fruits and veggies we don't want to feed them are onions and garlic and citrus or orange peels or anything like that. Now, some other examples of different types of food we want to make sure to keep them away from. Pizza, so any kind of processed food, especially anything that has grains or meat or cheese. Pasta, like I said, that's a type of grain, so we also don't want to be feeding them any of that. Bones, Worms won't really eat bones. They would take a long time to break down. So no kind of meat scraps or bones should be going into your worm bin. Yogurt is also not good. That's a type of dairy, so we don't want to be feeding them any sort of dairy. And then bread, of course. Being a grain, we shouldn't give them any form of bread or pastry or sandwiches or anything like that. So we want to stick to the fresh fruit and vegetable scraps in terms of what we're feeding our worms every week. And make sure to stay away from citrus, onions, and garlic, those few types of fresh fruits and veggies that they don't like. So those are the things that we're going to be feeding to our worms every week. And if we do everything that was just described there, we'll end up with beautiful compost, and we'll also have some really happy, healthy worms. So I was doing some harvesting of this worm bin, and I have a good handful of worms that I wanted to show you here. So you can see an example of some beautiful, thriving Red Wriggler worms. And if you look closely at them, you might notice some of those parts of their anatomy that I was talking about. So you can see this worm here has a Cletellum. That thick band around it is an interesting one to see. And based on that, you might also then be able to tell which end the Prostomium is at. So of course it would be at the top end of the worm, close to the Cletellum. So have a good look at those, friends. I won't keep them out too long, since as we know, they don't like to be exposed to the light. Just wanted to show you a beautiful pile of thriving Red Wrigglers. All right. So thank you all so much for joining us today to learn all about composting, Red Wriggler worms, and how to care for your own worm bin at home. I want to give a big thank you to the Greater Victoria Public Libraries for hosting this program and for inviting us to come talk to you all today to teach you more about composting, which we're really passionate about. I hope that you're all feeling inspired and that you might take up some form of composting in your own lives. It's a really important way to help care for the environment and make sure that we can grow healthy food for ourselves, our families, and our communities. Thank you so much for joining us. Goodbye from the Compost Education Centre.